Hi everyone, this is Rick Morgan. I'm the director at the Stifel Fine Arts Center, and what I'm going to do is show you a series of videos that are going to be working on a pottery wheel. Each video will have a separate skill or a separate technique that I'm going to show, so I hope you enjoy. Thanks. Hi everyone, today I'm going to show you how to create a plate on the pottery wheel. Few modifications that you're going to need to make on the pottery wheel before you start is one is you're going to need to place back pins onto your pottery wheel. Typically we throw our pots without these pins on, and so they're very simple and that you can just slide them in there like that. Now certain wheels will have a little bit more of a wobble to them, and to stop that wobbling you can take the time to then get a wing nut and put a wing nut underneath that bat pin so that you can tighten it up, which will keep those pins from shaking. This wheel tends to be pretty good and it doesn't really wobble too much. So what also you're gonna need is a bat, all right? What I have is a plastic black bat. Like this one because it has a couple rings on here already to help give you an idea of where the center is. And the plastic bats, the holes don't seem to get reamed out as much as the masonite bats. So what I always want to do is kind of line it up on there. Make sure that your bat's relatively clean to start, and double check the back. Sometimes if there's a chunk of clay on there, it can lift that bat up and you're not sure why the bat's wobbling, and sometimes it's just a chunk of clay. So make sure you have a clean bat. You can go over, press your bat down onto the pins, make sure that it is stuck on there really good and it's not going to wobble around too much. And then we need to get started. So I'm going to make a large plate, and the amount of clay that I have right now is 4 pounds of clay. This should make a very large dinner plate, almost somewhat of a platter. You can scale this back depending on the size of the plates. 3 pounds would probably be a good dinner plate. 2 pounds is probably a dessert plate, salad plate. A little smaller would be almost a tea saucer, okay? So first I need to get this thing centered, so I'm gonna line this up into the center of this clay, splat it down on here, double check. Like I said, this bat's nice because it has some rings on there. I can look to make sure that it is close to the center before I get started. Give it a couple good smacks on there, make sure that it's stuck on there really well, and then now I can start my wheel. So using a larger piece of clay like this is going to take a little bit more muscle and effort to center. So depending on where you're at and your skill level, sometimes 4 pounds of clay might be a little much. So look at scaling back, starting off with some smaller plates and then eventually working your way up to it. First thing I want to do, make sure my posture is good. I scoot up nice and close to the wheel, get my hands wet, make sure the clay is nice and wet. Also make sure that it's stuck down onto the wheel really well. And once again, when I center, I use the heel of my hand, kind of pushing it into the clay at the same time, using my right fingers to retract back towards my thumb. So slowly pushing in there, squeezing this clay up and up and up, easing off the pressure as I work my way up to the top. Doing this a couple times to really get this clay to move. And then when I'm pushing it back down, I'm letting my pinky rest over this top of this clay. Using the palm of my hand, I'm pushing with the palm of my hand on the side of that clay, which makes that clay fall down, and fall down. And controlling that fall, my left hand kind of holds that clay back as it's falling down so that it doesn't get out of control. I'm going to do that one more time just to make sure it's perfect. Once again, squeezing this clay up towards the top, easing the pressure off each time. So as I go in, I slowly build that pressure up until the clay moves, work my way up here, and now I'm going to slowly ease off that pressure. Same thing, pinky rest over the top, use the palm of my hand to push on the side of that clay. It starts to fall down, and I just follow that fall as I get down here towards the bottom. Now, because I'm making a plate, I want this to get a little bit flatter. So as I get it down close to this pump where normally I would start to open up a piece of clay, I'm actually going to use my fingers and the palm of my hand to just really kind of squash this down a little bit more flat and flat and flat. So it's kind of like almost getting into that pancake shape, all right? So this helps just kind of keep that clay from curving under and allowing air kind of to get trapped under there. So as I'm getting out here towards the edge, I'm going to taper it out a little bit so that it kind of domes itself off here. And now I'm ready to make this into a plate. So normally I was showing everybody how I use a peace sign, using my middle finger to open up this clay and then pull it apart. But because this is a plate, I want to use my fist. And so I use basically my pinky knuckle. I push down into the clay, and as I push down, it sinks into the clay, and then I slowly pull my hand back. So making sure I have it nice and wet, push down into the clay, and now I'm going to slowly start pulling the clay back and back and back. All right, so I'm basically trying to create a flat disc. Each time I do that though, I want to take a little time out here on the edge to make sure that I curve that down so that once again, there's not air or anything getting trapped underneath that piece of clay. All right, so just kind of using my finger to kind of smooth that off. Once again, the clay's pretty thick, so I'm going to make my fist once again, push it down into the center, press in there deep enough to where you can see my clay sinks down, my hand sinks down into the clay, and then slowly pull back out here towards this outer edge. What I'm trying to do is make this into a big flat disc of clay, and then I'm going to show you at the end how I'm going to make the edges of the plate. So what I want to do is really focus on thinning out this clay, making sure that it expands all the way out as far as I can. Got to be careful not to make it too thin. If you go too thin, typically end up running into some cracks where the clay is just so delicate that it almost breaks. So you also don't want to leave it so thick that the plate is very, very heavy. So what I'm trying to do now is I'm using the palm of my hand, or the heel of my hand, pushing in from the center out here towards the outer edge, and then you can push it back in there. And you're just trying to level things out. And if you're having trouble doing it with your fist, sometimes you can do it with your fingers, which I prefer, just kind of pushing it back and forth over here. But I also have another little tool, which is kind of like a rolling pin. And it's nice in the fact that, let's add a little bit of water to it so it stays nice and slick. You can hold that rolling pin down on here and pushing it out, and what it really does is helps flatten that clay out pretty flat and even. As you can see, I push down on there like that. It's good to use this one where the pins, the handles have been removed, because usually the handle ends up hitting the tray of your pottery wheel. So with this one being removed, I can go all the way out here towards the outer edge. I'm gonna add a little bit of water to this, make sure it's nice and slick. And then I can push this down and I can go all the way out to the outer edge and make it really nice and flat. So that just kind of really finishes off that edge, that top surface for me. Now, you do want to spend a little time on compressing this clay. So I like to use, but we've been compressing it each time by using our fist to squash that down. But you can also just take this little bit of time and effort to really kind of create almost a swirl in the clay and pushing it back in here towards the center and then pulling it back out here towards the outer edge. I'm pressing down just hard enough that it makes that little bit of a swirl, because what that's going to do is really compress the clay. It's pulling it back and pushing it back in, pulling it out, pushing it back in. And that's really going to help realign that clay particle so that it will help avoid that S-crack across your plate. So plates, I feel like, are very easy to make. They're just a challenge to have them survive. So if you can do this where you're doing the compression and really evening out the clay, your survival rate of a plate is much better, all right? So now I feel like I've got this. I've spent a little time pushing that in, pushing that back in to really realign those clay particles. And now I want to focus on creating the edge of my plate. So this is where I use a knife. So the knife really helps out to where, one, you can trim off any edges. You know, if the clay is a little bit wobbly out here, you can use this knife to come over and trim off any of that excess clay that you might have and make sure that it's perfectly flat and even, all right? So I've kind of trimmed that off. And now what I want to do is I'm going to slow my wheel down just a little bit, and I'm going to use my knife, and it has this angle going up here like this. So I use the flat edge on the bottom, and then what I do is I push the knife into the side of the clay, and the clay just rides up that angle of the knife, which gives me a lift onto my plate. So if you can, I'm going to slowly push in, and I'm usually looking at, if I'm looking at a clock, I'm over here maybe at 4 o'clock. Having the tip of the knife kind of rest down onto the wheel, onto that plastic bat, And then I'm going to slowly just start pushing it in, and into the clay. And you can see as I pushed in, it raised that edge up for me. All right, so if I come over now and just use my sponge to help kind of smooth off this edge a little bit and clean this off here, you can be finished with the plate now like this. All right, so I'm coming over here. It's nice, I've got my little edge right on here. It's gonna keep any of the clay from falling, or any of the food fall off your plate, and it's all raised up perfectly. Now, you typically will have a little bit of clay right here that you can pinch if you want to make it get a little bit wider, so that if you wanted a wider rim plate, you can do that. What I like to do first is, usually there's some excess clay that's on the bat from where I was scraping, so I like to just come over and get that off first so that it doesn't interfere with when I'm throwing this extra little rim up here. So I'm just kind of going around and cleaning that little edge off here real quick, so that way that's cleaned off. And now, just coming over, add a little bit of water onto that rim so that I have a little bit of slickness where I can grab that clay. And just as I normally would throw a piece of pottery, I'm just gonna go right here on this outer edge, slowly pinch and add some pressure here on the bottom. And then you can see I'm gonna slowly just start bringing this up, up, up. All right? So now I made this up a little bit taller, and now I can flatten it out. So the way I do that is I just slowly push my fingers out here on this outer edge. And now as I stretch it out of here, you can see I basically created a wider rimmed bowl. Or I'm sorry, a wider rimmed plate. Use my sponge, kind of clean up any moisture that's on here, any extra slip, and smooth everything off here. Up to you. Sometimes I like to create a little swirl in my piece of pottery on my plates, and it's not deep, but just enough to kind of give you some design. Usually the glaze falls into these groove lines pretty nicely. So I start right out here, slowly just push my finger out, 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 out. Kind of gives that nice little swirl across there, and then just finishing it off just by holding the sponge on here, just to smooth off all those edges so that you don't have a sharp edge. And now that I've done that, I'm finished. I do not like to cut the plate off of the bat. I tend to leave it on here and not worry about cutting. I let it dry, and then as it dries, it will end up releasing itself off of the bat. So let me pop this thing off here real quick. So if you can, I can kind of angle it a little bit for you, and you can see how I've kind of tapered the edges along here. And once the clay starts to dry, it'll shrink away from this bat, and then it just releases. The one thing I want you to be careful of is sometimes when we have our bat pins into the clay, you'll have some little holes underneath there, and the clay kind of sinks in there just a little bit. So once the clay gets to this leather hard stage, I just set it back onto this wheel, and then I use a trimming tool or a needle tool and just kind of undercut that clay and trim that off there just a little bit. That will help kind of finish everything off of there. And then whenever it releases off of the bat, usually the bottom is perfectly flat and smooth, so you don't really have to do any trimming. All right, hopefully you enjoyed this